Bonjour, welcome everyone. Bienvenue toutes et tous. On behalf of the Institute on Quebec Studies at the State University of New York, I'm Amy Southerton, Assistant Director, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Quebec Studies scholarly presentation titled Little Fists for Social Justice, Anti-Semitism, Community, and Montreal's Aberdeen School Strike of 1913. Organized by the Institute on Quebec Studies at SUNY Plattsburgh. And I'm also happy to express appreciation for sponsorship of this opportunity by the Quebec Ministry of International Relations and La Francophonie, as well as the United States Department of Education, Title VI. Because March is internationally known as the month of La Francophonie, the Institute on Quebec Studies traditionally offers programming on the SUNY Plattsburgh campus to celebrate our commitment to learning about our closest Francophone friend, Quebec, and its diverse cultures. Thank you, everyone. Merci beaucoup. We appreciate your participation and your interest. During our session today, we invite you to ask any questions at any time and to share your comments by using the Q&A box on your screen. The Q&A box is where we ask you to submit your questions and your comments to be addressed by the panelists. Thank you. We're pleased to offer today's programming in collaboration with the SUNY Plattsburgh course Introduction to Canada, taught by Professor Matthew Smith. Mr. Smith will introduce our audience to his class, and then Dr. Kirkey, Director of the Institute on Quebec Studies at SUNY Plattsburgh, will then moderate this session and introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Mary Ann Poutanen.
Okay, hi there. I'm Matthew Smith, and this is my wonderful class, Intro to Canada, CS 111A. Let's give ourselves a round of applause. Come on now, everybody. Okay. And I'm very excited because I haven't been to Canada for over 2 years, and I'm going on Friday. Yes. Anyway, so just a couple of words about the Canadian Studies program. And I've got some notes here. The Canadian Studies Interdisciplinary Program is one of the oldest and strongest undergraduate programs in the nation, founded in 1966. And we had our 50th anniversary a number of years ago, and it was amazing. In addition to yourself, more than 30 distinguished faculty, or myself, I'm reading. More than 30 distinguished faculty specialize in Canada-oriented teaching and research. So we've got people in history, business, poli-sci, you name it. We cover all the bases. It's interdisciplinary. This is a survey class, and we cover everything, economics, healthcare, pretty much everything. Between 30 to 40% of SUNY Plattsburgh's undergraduate student population enrolls in at least one Canadian content course. I've got 60 in this class. I've got 35 in another one, and there are 2 other sections that have an equal number. About 200 are enrolled in this class just this semester. And we have a lot of, and this is for you guys here, we have a lot of scholarship opportunities, and don't forget to ask me about them. I'm going to be putting something on Moodle about our scholarship opportunities. We have such as the Killam Fellowship Program, which provides funding of $5,000 per semester, $5,000 per semester for students accepted to study at any one of 20 Canadian universities. Anyway, without further ado, I give you Dr. Chris Kirkey, the Director of the Centre for the Study of Canada and the Institute on Quebec Studies. Dr. Kirkey.
Thanks, Matt. Greetings, everybody, and thank you most especially to our students from SUNY Plattsburgh who are here this afternoon. We appreciate your attention and willingness to change the focus of your course today to listen to Dr. Poutanen's talk. And briefly, and you may well have seen this, but by way of background, in February 1913, Jewish students at Montreal's Aberdeen School went on strike in response to a teacher's anti-Semitic comments. Using strategies they had learned at home, students picketed the school and marched in the streets to seek support from community leaders at the Yiddish-language newspaper Der Keneder Adler and at the Baron de Hirsch Institute. The strike, the reason we're looking at it today, has had long-lasting consequences for the Jewish community, for Protestant school board policy, and for the character of Quebec's education system. It's my pleasure to have a good friend, a great historian, a well-respected colleague who teaches interdisciplinary studies at McGill and history at Concordia University, Dr. Marianne Poutanen. She is a member of the Montreal History Group and the Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Montreal at McGill. She's published widely. She's done two excellent books that I'm happy to say I've read both of. Her current work focuses on hospitality, women's work in the hospitality industry in mid-19th century Montreal. But that's not what we're going to hear about today. We're going to hear about this fascinating case study and what it illuminates about the broader issues of Quebec's education system. Marianne will speak for, I think, about 30 minutes. And as Amy mentioned, if you have any questions, please put them into the chat session. I'll moderate a question and answer conversation with Marianne at the end. We encourage everybody, whether you're in Matthew's class or whether you're in the general audience today, to please consider submitting a question or an inquiry. Thank you. Marianne, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. Well, I do have a PowerPoint presentation, but it doesn't seem that I can bring it up, so I have to talk to you without it, unfortunately, but I'll do my best. But I want to begin by thanking, first of all, Professor Sutherden for making the magic happen so that I'm able to be here today, and also to Professor Kirkey and Professor Smith for the invitation to speak to you about the history of public schooling in Quebec, which I understand is the subject of today's class. And as you already know, Quebec's system of public education from 1846 to 1998 was confessional, divided between Catholics and Protestants, and that these rights were enshrined in our constitution called the British North America Act of 1867. It was renamed in 1982 as the Constitution Act. You may be wondering where children who were neither Catholic nor Protestant went to school. So my presentation today examines that very question. Jewish children attended Montreal's Protestant schools, and I'm speaking about Montreal. So in this presentation, I consider the accommodation of Jewish pupils in Protestant schools, and I do it through the lens of a strike that took place at the Aberdeen School in February 1913. I explore the reasons for this strike, some of the key narratives and actors at play, the outcome, and so much more. And together, we will consider the youthful strikers and their agency, relations between the Jewish community and the city's Protestant school board, divisions of class, social class, religious practices, language, and much more within the Jewish community, and of course, anti-Semitism. So I'm going to suggest to you today that the Aberdeen School strike reveals a close connection between the students, the labor activism of their parents, and the working class Jewish community along the St. Lawrence Boulevard, from whence the strikers came, and that their collective action reflects the historical agency of children and youth. So the research on the Aberdeen school strike is really actually based on Protestant school board documents, newspapers, including the Yiddish-language newspaper, the Keneder Adler, historical records of the city's Jewish archives, genealogical data gleaned from parish records, census returns, and city directories. And then all of this resulted in a co-authored article with Rod McLeod published in Labor Le Travail. That's one. It also resulted in a commemoration of the event. And then in an online graphic novel that we wrote in English, and it was illustrated by Derek Broad, and then translated into French and Yiddish. So the English version, as I understand, was made available for you to read. But before we actually get to the strike, let's take a look at the Jewish community in early 20th century Montreal. So as in the United States, Jewish migration to Quebec began in earnest at the turn of the 20th century. And most Jewish newcomers came from Eastern European villages, or Städtler, in what is today Russia, Poland, Romania, Lithuania, and the Ukraine. And for the most part, they settled in urban centers. For the most part, there are some exceptions. And Montreal actually was home to the largest Jewish community in Canada. And according to census returns in 1911 and 1921, and I know in the United States it's done in 1910 and 1920, the Jewish community grew from 30,000 to over 45,000. And most of the newcomers were poor, Yiddish-speaking, and Ashkenazi, having left Eastern Europe to escape political repression, compulsory military service in the Russian army, discrimination, pogroms, of course, and to seek economic opportunities in the face of rampant poverty. So with the development of a global industrial information network predicated on mass circulation newspapers, railways, telegraphs, and rapid postal services, information about jobs elsewhere in the world drew people to the Americas. And these migrants were, in the words of US historian John Bodner, children of capitalism. These new arrivals clustered along the corridor of St. Lawrence Boulevard, or what was popularly referred to as the Main. And I had a map so you could see it, but I have a question for the students, and maybe they could put up their hand. How many of them have been to Montreal? How many of them have actually eaten at Schwartz's, had smoked meat at Schwartz's? Okay, so that long street boulevard that begins at the port and goes all the way up, I don't know for how many miles or kilometers, as we would say in Canada or in Quebec. And it has been an important sort of pathway for quite a diversity of immigrants who end up in Montreal. And it's on the Main that that these Jewish newcomers recreated shtetl life. So the stores, the political and cultural institutions, synagogues and neighborhood parks and green spaces in that area served many functions. So not only as a site to purchase an array of goods like kosher food, clothing, and shoes, and Yiddish language newspapers and books, but also to exchange information and assist in the process of integration. Securing waged employment was an obvious priority for all of newcomers, or for all of the new arrivals, and many turned to the garment industry, or what we call the schmata trade, to work in nearby Jewish-owned factories, and it allowed for a short trek to work for much of the industry's labor force. So what about the kids who lived there? The children found endless distractions in the neighborhoods where they lived that helped to soften the harshness of poverty, the heavy responsibilities, and the uncertainty. And the Main itself was a constant source of entertainment, a cornucopia of sounds, sights, and smells, where children sought urban amusements and adventure. And they frequented green spaces such as Fletcher's Field and Dufferin Park. They attended the YMHA, the public bath, which offered free swimming lessons, and they watched silent films and vaudeville acts at local theaters. So the newcomers, which we also have referred to them as the downtowners, contrast sharply with a much smaller number of long-established English-speaking and largely well-to-do Jewish Montrealers, or we refer to them sometimes as uptowners, who lived in middle-class enclaves, and such as Westmount and Outremont. And they had actually set down roots really early in Quebec following the conquest. And these elites were ambivalent about the newcomers. Given the two groups' sharp differences in terms of social class, political organization, language, and culture, many in the original community were concerned that these Jewish newcomers would sully their hard-earned reputation with regard to the mainstream community, and in particular, respectable Anglophones. Moreover, the overwhelming need of impoverished immigrants strained the existing resources of Jewish charitable institutions, as well as relations between the established members and newcomers. So what I want to point out here is that the Aberdeen school strike was actually sandwiched between two really important moments in the history of this Jewish community. One, the 1912 Taylor strike, and in 1913, the Plamondon libel suit. So let me talk now about the Taylor strike. So the children of these neighborhoods were acutely aware of their parents, that they were struggling in a new country to make ends meet. Jewish workers were fully ensconced in the garment trade as cutters, tailors, finishers, that it was the Jewish owners of garment factories who provided employment to newcomers, and Jewish socialist organizers who strove diligently to unionize the mainly Jewish workers. This created further conflicts, tensions, and divisions within the community. And the conditions under which they labored, these conditions were appalling, and they resulted in this really long and bitter history of labor confrontations in Montreal's clothing industry. And the growing hostility, and there were a number of strikes, but there one in particular in June 1912, 4,000 tailors laid down the tools of their trade in Jewish-owned firms. And the labor confrontation became very public because these factory owners hired thugs, private detectives, and off-duty city policemen to physically attack picketing workers. Well, the union responded by organizing large rallies and parades in the heart of the schmata trade to protest. And this strike was surely the substance of lively discussions around kitchen tables in working class households, as well as on the streets, parks, and in synagogues frequented by garment workers and their children. And I want you to imagine for a moment these parades. They took place in the neighborhoods where the children who attended the Aberdeen school, they saw this. They saw these parades. They understood the labor politics. And in fact, that's one of the main things I want you to walk away from. Labor politics is not only learned on the factory floor, but it's learned on the laps of parents. It's learned around the Shabbat table. It's learned by observing what was happening in your neighborhood. It was learning by helping out a family member who was on strike. So it had a really strong impression on the children in the neighborhood. This acrimonious and bloody strike ended 2 months later, well, with some success by the workers, not a lot, but some. Workers won a small reduction in hours of work and an increase in the rate of piecework. But the situation for Jewish families would worsen in the fall of 1912, owing to an economic recession. So that's one really important moment that helps to set the scene for the strike. The second one is the Plamondon libel suit. So anti-Semitism was a constant feature of Montreal Jewish life, for adults, of course, but also for children. And even if it was sometimes obscured and in the background, Jewish Montrealers faced chronic prejudice as a matter of course, be it at the level of snubs and taunts, which could at times erupt into street fights, or even at a more official level. The years leading up to the Aberdeen school strike saw really a sharp increase in anti-Semitic incidents and the acidity of anti-Jewish discourse in Quebec. And this malicious tide crested in March 1910, when notary Jacques-Edouard Plamondon addressed a gathering of the Catholic Association of French Canadian Youth in Quebec City. And in that speech, he denounced Jews and Judaism. And this speech provoked several instances of street fighting and vandalism between Jews and Catholics, and really pushed the provincial Jewish elite and leaders to sue Plamondon for libel, claiming that such language incited violence against Jews and which potentially threatened lives and at the very least livelihoods. So the impending trial opened in May 1913. So it's just after the strike that I'm going to talk to you about. But you can imagine the kind of discussions that people would have been, this would have been on everyone's mind, this upcoming trial. So children as well as adults would have been discussing this because at the action of filing a suit on the grounds of defamation was itself unprecedented. So this is a little hard to do, but I had suggested that the students read the graphic novel on the strike. And I had a question, but I don't know that we can actually do anything with this. But I wanted to ask them, well, what can you tell me? What do you remember from looking at this graphic novel about the walkout, about the student strike? If you had anything that stands out or anything that you want to share. No? Okay, well, I'll just carry on then. I'm going to start talking about the strike. So, okay, so during the last week of February in 1913, Miss McKinley, she was a grade 6 teacher at the Aberdeen school, called her Jewish pupils dirty and declared that they ought to be banned from the school. Her outburst actually triggered a political storm at this inner city Protestant school, where Jewish children and youth constituted the vast majority of the student population. Well, you know, Jewish pupils would have been accustomed to discrimination, and they may have overlooked countless petty put-downs, but they must have been struck by the blanket application of Miss McKinley's accusation. For them, she had just gone too far. So Harry Singer, Frank Sherman, Joe Orenstein, Moses Skilbalski, and Moses Margulies, when they heard the teacher's remarks, they went to see the principal, Henry Cofield. And they went there to demand that the teacher apologize. Well, Cofield wasn't going to have anything to do with these students, and he didn't particularly like the boys in the school to begin with, and he dismissed them as troublemakers. And in fact, one of the scenes that I like in the graphic novel, which we can talk about later, is that moment when he's standing there and pointing his finger and to get out of his office. And I just think it's such a rich and powerful image. Well, the 5 boys, they were all in grade 6 and they aged between 12 and 13. And they responded to the principal's outright rejection of their concern by calling a strike. And I just want to make a point here that these boys of 12 and 13, many of them, most of the boys would not be going on to high school in 1913. They would be going out to work once they finished elementary school. So the way it worked was at least one child from each household would be chosen to go on to high school, but many of these boys weren't. And so they would have had their bar mitzvah and they would see themselves as men. And so they took on this leadership role. So it's not like ordinary 12 and 13-year-old boys that you think about right now. These boys were going to go out, most of them, to work. Well, in keeping with the logistics of labor protests that they had learned at home and in the community, the 5 boys set out to mobilize the student body. And it's at this point that I want to bring in children's agency. And I think and I do this because the Aberdeen school strike reveals that children's agency was at its heart. And in the motivations of the youthful strikers and in their use of labor strategies that they had learned at home and in the community. So the sociology of childhood recognizes children as social actors and capable of reflexivity, giving them voices rather than silencing them, and presenting them as active subjects, not passive ones, of social structures and processes. So instead of perceiving adults, especially parents and teachers, as exercising power over children in a variety of circumstances and places, sociologist Madeline Leonard argues that we ought to see adults and children as negotiating the expectations that they have of each other within families. So, but that said, agency has limits, and agency is essentially individualistic. And that agency does not mean an absolute lack of influence from families, community or institutions. And the responses of the Aberdeen strikers to Miss McKinley's anti-Semitic comment is evidence, from my perspective, of autonomous action, albeit within the limitations exposed by parental and institutional authorities. So let's move to the strike. So hundreds of Jewish pupils congregated in St. Louis Square. It was a park across the street from the school where they organized pickets. And the numbers are estimated. It ranged from say 200 to 600, depending on the newspaper. So the Keneder Adler had it at 600, and I think the Gazette at 200. So in the park, they appointed the 5 boys who had met with the school principal as strike leaders. And I want you to pay attention to the language. And to resolve to uphold solidarity by not returning to class until authorized by the strike leaders to do so, and to consider any strike breaker a scab. The young leaders inspired labor discipline on the picket line, so much so that by the afternoon, reporters described the crowd of children as, quote, behaved with almost perfect conduct. There was no booing or hissing, and not even one snowball was thrown, end of quote. The student leaders were also very clever because they knew they needed to get help. They needed solidarity, and they needed to get solidarity from the larger Jewish community. So some students marched to the newspaper office of the Keneder Adler, and others to the Baron de Hirsch Institute. At the Keneder Adler, they really found a sympathetic audience in its editor, the Russian-born intellectual Reuben Brainin. And while he was already impressed by the cultural resilience of Jewish diaspora communities in North America, Brainin claimed to have never seen this level of resistance to discrimination on the part of the youngsters. Another group marched off to the Baron de Hirsch Institute. The students presented their case to representatives who agreed to call a meeting of the legislative committee to decide on a course of action. So this is, again, this insight that these students had. They knew that that the school authorities would never negotiate directly with them, and that they needed Jewish community leaders to help them to resolve this conflict. However, the Jewish community leaders had mixed feelings about the strikers. You know, picketing children reminded them of the labor militancy displayed by their parents in the recent strike of the 4,000 tailors. They may have even seen these children as the next generation of striking garment workers, but they could hardly oppose their intentions, given that the strike was a response to anti-Semitism. So the committee members appointed Rabbi Herman Abramovich of the prestigious Shar Shemoyim synagogue and lawyer Samuel Jacobs as negotiators to intervene on behalf of the students. Rabbi Abramovich had a cautious response to the strikers, and doubted the boys' interpretation of the teacher's statement. They met with the principal and the teacher, Miss McKinley, who, quote, expressed her regret for having made inappropriate comments which were misunderstood by the children, end of quote. While this did not constitute the apology that they asked for, the students agreed to return to class the following Monday, leaving it to their elders to resolve the crisis with the school board. So what I want to do now is take just a bit of a step back and to set the scene of this strike, because I think you need to know a little bit more about the Aberdeen School. It was named after the Earl of Aberdeen, Governor General of Canada at the time, and it opened in 1895. It quickly became one of the largest schools in the Protestant system. So by the turn of the century, owing to the increasingly dense neighborhood composed mainly of recent Jewish immigrants, quickly the school became the majority of the school's population were the majority was Jewish. And I had a pie chart that showed exactly that it's so striking, the number of the children in 1913 at the time of the strike who were Jewish. And this didn't sit well with school commissioners because the changing demographics of their city schools touched on a kind of a cruder nerve. And while anti-Semitism was rarely expressed explicitly in their discourse, it was never very far from the surface. And notwithstanding the school board's legal obligation to educate Jewish children from 1903, tensions between the school board and the Jewish community grew following a drawn-out dispute over taxation. Since only a wealthy minority of Jews owned property and therefore paid school taxes, Protestants came to feel that they were accommodating increasing numbers of Jewish pupils whose parents made no contribution to the education. I do want to point out, however, that they paid school fees collected by the teachers every month. This taxation dispute also contributed to hostility on the part of teachers toward their Jewish students. It did not help relations within classrooms that all the teachers were Protestant, even at schools like Aberdeen, again, where the student population was mostly Jewish. So for Jewish children, having only Protestant teachers probably wasn't so surprising, nor a Protestant curriculum suffused with Christian elements, from readings drawn from the New Testament to singing daily hymns such as Jesus Loves Me. They may have absorbed these elements uncritically, but given the timing and substance of Miss McKinley's anti-Semitic remark, her students might have looked around their classroom and noted that they were all Jewish and thus the target of her malice. It might have also struck them that the Protestant teachers were the anomaly in the classroom and that her outburst was especially offensive. So in this way, I think that the ground had shifted. So after Rabbi Abramovich and Samuel Jacobs met with the principal and the school board and teacher, they came to accept that the students' actions were justified, or at the very least bordered on anti-Semitism. And Abramovich and Jacobs made two demands to resolve the strike. The teacher, Miss McKinley, was to be transferred to another school, and the children were to be accepted back with no recriminations. Cofield, however, refused and threatened to expel the students. But the Protestant school board commissioners found themselves faced really with an embarrassing situation that put the school board in the worst possible light. And they were prepared to concede to some of the strikers' demands in return for peace in the schoolyard. None of the strike leaders were expelled, and the principal was effectively silenced. And as for Miss McKinley, it's unclear what happened to her. So I want to conclude now with what I call lessons learned from the strike. So you may be tempted to see this student action as an example of youthful exuberance, not to be taken seriously as a genuine strike. Certainly most contemporaries appear to have paid it little heed. The school board minutes are silent, and the press coverage was by and large dismissive. That there's a far greater level of complexity in the reactions of adults to the strike, which ranged from pride to outrage, embarrassment, and anxiety. And moreover, the strike had long-lasting consequences for the Jewish community, the Protestant school board policy, and the character of Quebec's education system. The Aberdeen school strike marked a turning point in the history of the city's Protestant school board. Within weeks of the strike, the commissioners asked legal counsel to inquire if the provisions of the Education Act would allow them to hire Jewish teachers. And the next year, 4 Jewish teachers were hired. And within a decade of the strike, the board was employing 70 Jewish teachers, hardly enough to go around all of the schools on the Main, but it was an improvement. The school strike had an impact on the outlook of the Jewish community towards schooling. Since the beginning of the 20th century, Jewish elites had taken the position that attending Protestant schools ensured Jewish children's integration into North American society. By contrast, newcomers valued the preservation of Eastern European culture, including the Yiddish language, and they mistrusted non-Jewish authority over their lives. The more religious among the families opted to send their children to the Talmud Torah school, and they would establish similar schools in the years following the strike. And in fact, by 1917, there were 5 such schools in the city. More significant was a growing support by non-observant Jews for independent schools. And by the late 1920s, they would champion the formation of a separate school board in opposition to elites who still favored integration into Protestant schools. So the city's Protestant school board began actively promoting the idea of this separate school board. And at the same time, the Jewish community had to continue negotiating its place in Protestant schools. But it's the strikers who emerged as winners despite the odds. They were never publicly disciplined. They received an apology of sorts, and they set in motion a process that would result in much better Jewish representation among public school teaching. They had initiated the strike action without securing permission from their parents, who proved to be supportive. And by refusing to tolerate anti-Semitism, the student drew attention in their community to a systemic problem in the school system that had links to prejudice within the larger society. They learned the value of taking action against injustice. And it was an issue around which the entire community could rally, albeit cautiously in some cases. So ethnic and religious solidarity prevailed. The strike also bolstered the children's cultural identity, both in the neighborhood and with the Jewish community at large. They had grown up with this identity, absorbing it at home, in the streets, and in the social life of the St. Lawrence Boulevard corridor. They had their own notion of citizenship predicated on Jewish identity, working class solidarity, and social justice. So that's
Thank you so
what I
much.
wanted to tell you about the strike.
No, it's fascinating to say the very least. And before I throw some questions and comments your way, I wanted to encourage everyone who's with us in Matthew's class or at home to please feel free to utilize the raise hand feature. If you have any inquiries for Marianne, that would be wonderful. And Matthew, I don't know if you want to lead off, or would you like me to lead off with an observation? Go ahead.
Okay, well, this is actually a very auspicious day to talk about Jewish students in Montreal, because I grew up in NDG, and today is the 91st birthday of William Shatner, who went to high school at Westmount High School across the street from where I grew up in NDG. He graduated in 1948. A little bit before my time, but Captain Kirk. Also, in full disclosure, my first job was actually in the schmata business in Montreal at Johnny Brown's Theatrical Supplies. Anyway, so while you're talking, my brain is going ping, 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 because I also teach a Canadian cinema class. And the films that I always show is the Trotsky. Do you know that film?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I'm wondering if the Trotsky was based on this strike, because the similarities are incredible.
Well, it could have been based on another strike in 1934 when students at the Baron de Hirsch High School responded to an increase in the school fees that practically doubled. And in 1934, it was one of the worst years of the Great Depression. And so the students at Baron de Hirsch High School went out on strike. So it's likely based on that one. I think, and it's an interesting one because the students didn't win anything in that strike. In part, I think because of anti-communism, and they were sort of linked to the communist youth. And yeah, so, but it's the Aberdeen school strike that is so, it actually did have consequences, but not a lot of people know about it.
Well, I'm thinking that you're probably right, because obviously in the Trotsky, the protagonist, Leon Bronstein, thought he was the incarnation of Leon Trotsky and tried to match his life and took over the school, as you know, and organized the students. Right, I think we're going to show that movie in class towards the end of the semester, because I think it's a great movie. I really do. And it's parallels. I thought it paralleled the Aberdeen strike, but you're probably, what was the name of the other strike?
It's a 1934 student strike at Baron de Hirsch High School. Yeah, and it's also interesting that Madeleine Perron, her partner, he was 17 years old, and that was the first strike he participated in. He was a strike leader in 1934. So.
Dr. Kirkey.
Thank you, Matthew. And once again, please feel free to raise your hand if you want to join in terms of having any inquiries for Marianne. Marianne, do we know, for example, this is 1913, this happens.
Yep.
And given the environment of 1913 versus 2022, what seems to be a one-off remark by Miss McKinley, not a pattern of anti-Semitic remarks that she had introduced in the classroom, but if I understand this correctly, a one-off remark, seems quite a response on the part of the Jewish student community.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know when this is, it's a sort of roundabout way of asking you, what do we know? What does the historic record show of her as an instructor? Were there other outbursts similar to this?
And that, yeah, no, I don't know that. I mean, it has a lot to do with the kind of historical records that I have, that I was able to look at. So, you know, I had this wish that, because I advertise, I wrote in the one of the Jewish newspapers, and there was a blog that was sent out. If anyone has any photographs or a diary, anything to do with this Aberdeen school strike, you know, and my fantasy was that somebody would come with a treasure trove of documents and photographs, and I would be like, hallelujah, you know, it'd be this eureka moment. But we didn't have that. I mean, just that I wasn't able to show you the PowerPoint, but I found one image of that strike. I was sitting in the Jewish archives going through files, and suddenly it was there, that not even the archivist knew about it. And it was one of those, again, eureka moments. Oh my God, look at this. But no, I do know that there's a long history of anti-Semitism in Montreal. It took many different forms. That kids as adults spoke a little bit about that. the kinds of things that they had to endure. And, you know, at that, all through the early 20th century, for sure. So Rod and I just assumed that anti-Semitic comments were just part of your daily life. And so the question was to us, why then? Why did the students respond in the way they did to that remark? And I think it has a lot to do with the Plamondon case, this libel suit. People were talking about it. And I think that that's really, really important. It was part of the discussion everywhere. And you can see that in the newspaper, in the different, well, at least in the Keneder Adler. And so we just, you know, it's one of these moments where you sort of say, you could just imagine this classroom hearing this, and the kids look around the classroom and go, oh my God, the only person who's not Jewish is the teacher, and she's making this comment. So I think it was just a combination of factors coming together, and we're not going to take it anymore.
Right.
And because it was so awful, calling them all dirty, which was, you know, code for having lice.
Right, of course. But it strikes me that I'd be surprised. I mean, I know you don't have the documentary evidence to suggest this, but I'd be very much surprised if this particular instructor hadn't engaged in that sort of behavior previously.
Yeah.
I mean, just my instinct tells me, but instinct only takes you so far. I wanted to ask or make an observation and just ask for your comments on this. And that is that when you talked about sort of the urban experience of Montreal for Jewish newcomers, or as you termed downtowners, it made me think of a book I read a couple of years ago. And that is, it makes me think of how unique was this experience for newcomers, Jewish newcomers in Montreal. When I think of what I've read, and I haven't read extensively on this, obviously, but when I think of the Jewish experience for newcomers at the same time period, late 19th and early 20th century, I think about Manhattan.
Yeah, exactly.
More specifically, the Bronx, and what you described
is the same.
Is effectively the same. I mean, if you go, and you know, it's kind of odd to say this, but if you go and take a look at a book that came out a couple of years back by Robert Bader, B-A-D-E-R, and it's got a funny title. It's called Four of the Three Musketeers, the Marx Brothers on Stage, and it is by far and away, the most definitive account that will ever be produced of the Marx Brothers, particularly during the 1910s and 20s. But when they talks about the brothers growing up in New York during that period, it's exactly the same as the sort of circumstances that Jewish downtowners were experiencing in Montreal. Fascinating. So you have to, you know, very, very, very clear parallels there. So.
Oh, I agree completely. And, you know, Montreal drew these newcomers. There was work in the schmata trade for them. And I think there are parallels between Montreal and New York, for sure.
Okay. Something else that occurred to me when you were speaking today is, you know, there's a period, and it's certainly not specific to Canada, although there are some notable examples in Canada, but it's a period in sort of the world, if you will, and I want to be, you know, put that in quotation marks, but it's a period of broad labor unrest. And I know this is a very small slice of the apple with somewhere between 200 and 600 students, but it coincides with that time period in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. You think of the Canadian context, obviously there's much more significant episodes we could talk about, Winnipeg in 1919 and so on, but it's just a fascinating, and the Taylor strike that you had brought to our attention too. It's fascinating. It's part of a larger period in Canadian history and global history. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's also at a particular moment in industrialization, right? And,
Absolutely.
you know, and what does that mean? And, you know, it was this period where you start seeing workers trying to unionize with the help actually of Jewish organizers from the United States who came up to, it wasn't only homegrown organizers, but the unions that they were trying to form were international unions with
Right.
clear links to the United States, especially in the garment trade. So, and you know, it took a while before they could start to win. And you know, one of the biggest strikes took place during the Great Depression in 1937 when women went out, and it was not just Jewish women, but French Canadian women, immigrant women who went out, 5,000, 7,000 of them, and they were able to win that strike. But it's still, you know, it's the garment trade. So, and now there's no really not a garment trade, you know, industry anymore. I mean, there's a little tiny bit, but it's all gone.
Sort of almost inconsequential.
Yeah, yeah.
We have an inquiry, Marianne, that someone's interested. Were there any similar protests or incidents at McGill University as the Jewish enrollment at the institution, it's suggested here, started to increase around 1915, or was higher education in Montreal less overtly anti-Semitic?
Well, I can talk about McGill a little bit, although I can't say that I've studied it well, but we do know that at McGill, there were quotas. And first of all, you have to, you know, if you think about 1913 and the strike, and those kids are going they're going to go out to work, most of them, somebody from each family, because in these Jewish households, education was really important. And families made great sacrifices in order to have at least one child who would have a high school education, and the dream was a child would go on to university. But most of the kids, that wasn't possible. So at McGill, there were quotas on Jewish students. They in order to get accepted, they had to have higher marks than non-Jewish students. It took them a while to be accepted into some of the professional programs. So it wasn't easy to get in, and I would imagine the pressure on a Jewish student who did get in. There's a lot of expectations on his shoulders. But the other interesting thing is that social mobility is really rapid amongst the families from this area. You know, practically in one generation, they've moved out. And, you know, you already see it in the 1940s. You're already seeing families moving out of this corridor and moving to places like Côte de Neige and places like this, because social mobility is, for the Jewish community in Montreal, it's pretty rapid. And it, you know, before long, you know, you're getting more. So many of the children are university educated and professionals.
I'm going to throw one I think, concluding question you're raised this evening, and that is to say, you underscored that arguably the most lasting and significant commitment or impact, rather, of the student strike was this increase in Jewish representation amongst Montreal teaching ranks. And so my question to you is, when you looked at that and you chronicled, you gave us two statistics to think about, sort of the almost immediate impact and then the sort of impact several years out. Do the records show that Protestant school board administrators sat back as a result of this strike and said, hey, whoa, we need to change we need to diversify our teaching composition. We need to, in fact, have some Jewish instructors because we have a large contingent of Jewish students. Is there anything that explicit?
No.
No, eh?
No, in fact, they're silent. But, you know, I have studied the Protestant school boards all through Quebec, and particularly in Montreal. And one of the things that I have come to understand really well is that they can't stand bad publicity. They may not talk about it in their minutes, but they can't stand it. And this is something that the Jewish community uses in the future about the quality of the schools, not the schooling, but the schools, and the ones that are getting really run down. They can't stand this. And so they want to get rid of the complaint. And so I think this really pushed them toward getting more. I mean, they start off really slowly for.
Yeah, sure, of course.
But the other thing too you have to remember is it took them a long time. It was a long time before you even get Jewish representation on the school board.
Yeah.
There's really a push that comes from this, a strike by two Jewish municipal councilors who are really trying to get representation, and they can't. And it doesn't happen until 1973. 1973.
Incredibly late.
Yeah.
On that point, I know students have to wrap up class, and we really appreciate your time and attention and your patience at the outset of today's presentation. Please join me this afternoon, early this evening, in thanking Dr. Poutanen. Marianne, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm sorry I took so long to give my talk.
Thanks, everybody. And I'm going to turn it over to Amy. Amy, please.
Thank you, Mary Ann. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Matthew. At this time, we ask for audience feedback on this session with the Zoom poll on your screen. So we appreciate your interest in SUNY Plattsburgh Institute on Quebec Studies' mission and commitment to the visible development, expansion, and dissemination of Quebec Studies among academic, business, and government constituents. For more information on Quebec Studies programming at SUNY Plattsburgh, check out our webpage, www.plattsburgh.edu/IQS, and please do sign up for our mailing list from the news and events page. You could also sign up by visiting tinyurl.com/IQS mailing. Our next event is in person only, but we would love for our audience to join us if you are in the Plattsburgh vicinity. It's taking place this Thursday, March 24th at 5 p.m. The SUNY Plattsburgh Distinguished Fulbright Chair in Quebec Studies, Dr. Jean-François Gadbout, Professor of Political Science visiting SUNY Plattsburgh from University de Montreal, will present the Distinguished Fulbright Chair in Quebec Studies lecture in person only in Crinovitz Hall on campus in Hawkins Hall. The title of his presentation is Stability and Change in the 2022 Quebec Election. Then on Wednesday, April 13th at 2 p.m., we will virtually host Dr. Jean Carey Ingle, who will discuss intentional inclusion, multiculturalism, and multilingualism in K-8 classrooms, learning from Toronto's success. So you can sign up for that at tinyurl.com/Canadian Studies April 13th. We look forward to your participation next time, and thank you so much for staying in touch with us. Enjoy your evening. I'm happy to now conclude this presentation. Merci bien et au revoir.